Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar, The Right CMS on the Right Platform from Progress Sitefinity in Microsoft Azure. My name is Barrett Coakley. I am the Senior Manager Product Marketing for Sitefinity and I will be your host today. First, let's get into some logistics of the webinar. We will be sending out a link to this recording, so you will be able to watch it or share it at a later date with colleagues who are not able to make it. We will be answering questions both throughout the webinar in the chat box as well, in the question box, as well as possibly at the end of it if we have time permitting. So with that, let's get into our webinar. The first one to do is look at, just give a brief overview of the Sitefinity platform. So a lot of you are probably familiar with it, but I figured it would be helpful just to make sure we are all on the same page. First, the Sitefinity platform has two components to it. One is a web content management system that allows you to build websites and portals and e-commerce and mobility. And the second one is a marketing analytics platform, which really acts as a marketing command center, digital marketing command center that lets you do customer journey analysis and audience management, personalization and attribution analysis, and really to use data to drive great next steps for it. Some of the benefits and things that people like about our platform are its easy accessibility and integration, its global deployment capabilities, multi-site capabilities and security, as well as its ease of use for marketers and business users with its great UI and UX. So with that, let me introduce today's speakers. So today we have two speakers from Falafel Software. So Falafel is located in California. They are a Progress partner, and they are also an 8-time Microsoft Gold certified partner that has been providing custom software development, consultation, and training services worldwide since 2003. Chris Langford is going to be one of our speakers today, and he is a developer, architect, marketer, and general technologist. He has been in the software industry 15 years, spanning engineering, lean startup, DevOps, consulting and solutions, lean agile teams, and product management. Chris has participated in numerous startups, consulting companies, and actually has been a senior product manager for Microsoft, where he led the charge for developer tools and the cloud. Venkata Kopaka has over 7 years experience developing a variety of line of business applications to various financial and IT organizations. Venkata actually worked at the Sitefinity team, is an expert developer, and was a senior developer for e-commerce module and is interested in developing custom solutions for Sitefinity-based e-commerce stores as well. So with that, Chris and Venkata, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Barrett. Thank you, everybody, for joining. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. We're going to talk a little bit about Sitefinity. We're going to talk a lot about the cloud and why that's important. So the first thing we want to talk about is why consider the cloud, right? So as many people have done, with Sitefinity, they run it on-premise, right? So they run it on-premise. They usually run it in virtual machines or physical boxes. And that's great. It runs well. It does its thing. But one of the things that we're going to get out of the cloud, right, and I want to say everybody's doing it, but a lot of people are moving to the cloud, so we're going to show you how to do that. So some of the things that we're going to get from moving Sitefinity to the cloud is we're going to get some reduced costs. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like, and not only from moving from virtual machines on-premise or in a data center, but into the cloud, and the difference between infrastructure as a service, which is VMs, and platform as a service, which we're going to talk about today, and how to deploy Sitefinity to that. Another thing, we're also instant scalability, right? So we can scale vertically, we can scale horizontally. I'll talk a little bit about those at the end. So we're going to see some scalability. We're going to show you how to scale websites both vertically and horizontally, and we'll explain what that means, horizontal and vertically, when we get to that point. The next piece we're going to talk about is DevOps and how easy that is now, right? With Sitefinity 9 and starting in, I think it was 8.2, there was the introduction of web apps for deployment with Sitefinity. So we're going to talk a little bit about the DevOps piece of that. Venkata is actually going to show you how to deploy. So he's going to show you how to get your Sitefinity site into Azure Web Apps and talk about that. He's also going to talk a little bit about the DevOps motion. So there's some great tools now with the introduction of being able to go to Web Apps, then also having source control and doing automated deployments and the tooling around that. So DevOps has begun, it's easier with Sitefinity 9 and Azure, right? So thinking about Sitefinity plus Azure, you know, a lot of the pain that you had to go through to do deployments is pretty easy. And I mentioned there kind of everybody's doing it. We're seeing, you know, we're both a cloud partner with Microsoft from Falafel. We're also a Sitefinity partner as well. So we do see a lot of customers starting to take advantage of the cloud, right? So, and we'll talk a little bit about the difference between, you know, the cloud services that they're going into. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the difference between platform as a service and infrastructure as a service, right? So today, if you think about a virtual machine and you were to just what we call lift and shift, or you take your virtual machine from on-premise and you go and deploy it into the cloud, you can certainly do that. You can get elasticity, you can get scalability, you can get some of those things directly from that. But you're still going to manage your virtual machine, which means you still need to patch it yourself, you still need to go update it, you still need to manage it, right? So you're still managing infrastructure. And so the big difference between IaaS and PaaS is on the PaaS side, you don't manage the infrastructure. You do have a little less control from that standpoint, but what you gain out of it is the fact that you don't have to manage it, right? So in this case, in Microsoft Azure, Microsoft's going to take care of patching it, making sure that it's new machines, making sure that you know, it's not vulnerable, it's not open, those sort of things. So all the things that you would have to go do from a management perspective, Microsoft is going to take care of for you. So basically what we're going to do, and you're going to see today, is we're going to say, hey, we want to go deploy this app, and we want to run it on platform as a service, and we really don't have to worry about the hardware. We can still do sizing, so we can say how much memory we want and how many processors we need, but other than that, we don't specify OSs or specify ports or things like that, right? Those things just happen for us automatically, and so we get to get the benefit of having, you know, a virtual machine with a particular amount of memory without having to go through all the things to set it up and manage it for the lifetime of running it. So those are the really big things about platform as a service versus infrastructure as a service. So, you know, we're not just going to show you how to take your Sitefinity site and run it in a virtual machine in Azure. We're actually going to show you how to take advantage of the platform and not just web apps, right? So there's a lot of pieces to Azure, and I'm going to walk you through the Azure portal here in a minute before Venkata does his demo. So thinking about Sitefinity and Azure, there's some really key pieces that you're going to want to take a look at, and we're going to show those here in a minute. But one of the first pieces is going to be web apps. So web apps are IIS or ASP.NET websites. They can definitely run things like PHP and Node. In this particular case, we're going to have it run Sitefinity, which is an ASP.NET website, so it can definitely do that. The next thing we're going to take a look at as well is going to be SQL. So SQL, you know, if you're on-premise, you have to run it on a virtual machine. So in the cloud, you're going to get the ability to go ahead and run that as a SQL as a service, right? So we don't have to manage SQL, we don't have to patch it, we don't have to worry about backups, or you know, if you're worried about redundancy, Microsoft takes care of the redundancy for you. They automatically have 3 failover clusters for each database that's out there, so you're guaranteed it's going to be up and running all the time. And so as I go through here and mention this, what I do want to do is kind of walk you through the Azure portal. So I'm going to go ahead here and take a look at the Azure portal. So this is the Azure portal here. There we go. All right. So I want to walk through this. When you log into the Azure portal, they do have what we call a blade system. So we'll talk a little bit about that. You do have a dashboard. You can make new dashboards if you want to. This is Venkata's account. He's going to be in here deploying some stuff, so we're going to both use this and show you kind of what's going on. You can see there's Azure, there's a website, there's CPU percentages. There's lots of metrics you can put on the dashboard, which is great, so you can get just a quick overview of where your apps and things are running. So in here, we talked about a few. We talked about web apps. We talked about SQL Azure. Some other things that you're going to be able to take advantage of from a Sitefinity perspective. You're going to be able to take advantage of search, right? So we know search is a painful thing, right? There's some search that comes out of the box with Sitefinity. You're also going to be able to implement Azure Search. And so what that's going to give you the ability to do is use search as a service, so you don't need to go run it anywhere, and you can actually get instant scalability with that. You can also as well, if you're looking to have Sitefinity and possibly maybe you're integrating with another site, you can also share that so that you could actually get search results in Sitefinity, not only for Sitefinity, but also related sites, right? So when people are doing searches, they would get the searches all in the same place. So really cool stuff. You also want to take advantage of Redis cache. So whenever you start to think about scaling horizontally, which is more machines, one of the things that you'll need to take advantage of in web apps is a way to cache your data across the machines. And in the past it was NLB, so network load balancing, and whenever you run this as Azure Web Apps. If you're just doing a single site, you don't need a Redis cache, but if you're going to run multiple apps for one site, you will need Redis in the background to make sure that they communicate and have a place and layer to communicate with. So you can actually run Redis as a service here, so you don't have to stand up a new machine or manage that on your own. You can just run it as a service, connect to it, and it would be your caching service in between. Another cool thing that you can do in here, a lot of times, with content management, we need a place to store our content. Traditionally, that's kind of been on disk. Obviously, in Sitefinity, you can have multiple places where you go and store data. One of the great things that they have for Azure is they're going to give you the ability, or you already have the ability, to store images in blob storage. And so, we're talking about pennies per gigabyte in Azure, so it is actually a good storage mechanism. It's fast, it's redundant, and it'll give you the ability to scale out your images and content without having to kind of bloat your database, right? So you don't need to store in the database, you can store it in blob storage, and Sitefinity knows how to talk to blob storage and store and retrieve images. So it works out really well. The last thing that I'd mention as well, a lot of people use Sitefinity and ASP.NET in general, and one of the things that they want to be able to do is run jobs where a really good example of this is something, if you're familiar with ASP.NET, it kind of goes to sleep over a period of time. We use something called Pingdom. Since they've introduced job collections, we started using job collections in Azure, so it gives us the ability to ping a particular URL on a frequency. Those jobs can also kick off other URLs, they can kick off web jobs, they can do a lot of things, but they actually give you the ability to go ahead and create just a simple, hey, ping this website, every 25 seconds or 1 minute, right, to keep it alive and functional, and to make sure that it doesn't have to do a startup cycle whenever it's getting a request. So it can go ahead and do that for you. I'd also go ahead, I'm going to go through just some of the other kind of high-level things that you'll want to kind of take advantage of in Azure. So definitely Active Directory, if you're thinking about integrating Active Directory and all those sort of things, you can use Active Directory in the cloud. So you can either start there, or you can migrate, or you can actually do a combination of on-premise cloud with replication as well. There's some other cool things in here. We have app services. We're going to talk about that a little bit. You also have application insights. So you have the ability to get metrics around your sites as well. So if you're looking for things like crash reporting, or you want to go in, I know that many of us use Google Analytics, but they also have experience analytics in here where you can actually take code from application insights and you can go in and put it into your website, and you can get information about some of the things that you see in Google Analytics, like paths and things like that as well. But you're also going to see things like errors. So like, for instance, if there was a JavaScript error in the page, it would actually show up in Application Insights as an error, so you could see it, right? And if multiple people were getting that, then you'd be able to take advantage of the analytics that you gather there. It can also gather server-side analytics for you as well. And I don't know, we'll have to ask Venkata. I haven't tried App Insights directly with Sitefinity, I'm guessing that it works because it's an ASP.NET website, but maybe Venkata can talk a little bit more about that. And I probably just put him on the spot right there, so he's probably not very happy about that. All right, and then we have some other things in here. There's batch accounts, container services. There's a ton of services, so I won't go through all of them. But as you can see, the list is very long, keeps growing all the time, and there's just a ton of things that you can take advantage of in here. All right, so with that, I've given you a pretty good overview of this. Venkata, do you want to go ahead and start your portion of this?
Absolutely.
All right, let me make you a presenter here. All right.
All right. Welcome everyone. Today I'll be showing you how you can get your Sitefinity website onto Microsoft Azure. Chris basically talked about all the greatness that Azure provides from both from an infrastructure as a service point of view and a platform as a service point of view. I'll be mainly focusing on the platform as a service offerings in Azure, and I'll be showing you how we can use Sitefinity along with Azure in that point. A little bit of history before I jump into showing you all the things is what I want you all to understand is Sitefinity is an ASP.NET application underneath. What that really means for developers or people who are managing sites is whatever possibilities there are with Microsoft Azure, which are supported with ASP.NET, they're also pretty much applicable with Sitefinity as well. Now, traditionally, this has been the Microsoft's infrastructure as service offerings with Azure VMs. So Sitefinity always used to work with Azure VMs. You just have to go spin up a new VM. You can basically deploy your website to that particular VM or even a cloud service for that matter of time. But like Chris mentioned earlier in the webinar, that also automatically involves a little bit of more maintenance on your IT team or in your development team. So what I'll be showing today is the platform as service offerings we'll be deploying to an Azure website, which is an app service offering that Microsoft provides. So let's go ahead and get started. One of the other thing that I want to mention is Sitefinity's website support. Sitefinity's Microsoft Azure website support is starting from Sitefinity version 8.2 and above. Now, if you're using Sitefinity version that is below 8.2, I highly recommend you to upgrade to 8.2 so that you can benefit out of all these good things that I'm going to be showing you. So I'm right now inside Visual Studio, and this is right where I want to talk about some prerequisites to doing this Azure deployment with Sitefinity. To do Azure deployment with Sitefinity, you have three prerequisites with Sitefinity. The first one is Azure SDK. So Azure team ships an SDK that Sitefinity team also uses. So you have to be at least targeting Azure SDK 2.6 or above. You can obviously be in the latest version of Azure SDKs as well, but 2.6 is the minimum Azure version that Sitefinity team supports. Now, if you are using a newer version of Azure SDK, I'll actually show you in a minute how you can utilize Sitefinity. You have to do a little bit of tweaking there and how to get Sitefinity to work with the latest version of Azure SDK. The second prerequisite is Visual Studio itself. Like I said, think of the entire process that I'm going to be showing you as any other ASP.NET web application. So whatever you're able to do with ASP.NET, you should be able to do it here as well. So to support directly publishing from websites, from your ASP.NET website from Visual Studio back onto Azure, you at least need Visual Studio 2013 with update to install. So you can download that from the Microsoft site. It's a free download. There's no really no reason not to install any update. So that will give you functionality that is required to publish your Sitefinity website from Visual Studio, right from Visual Studio into the Microsoft Azure App Service. The last requirement that I'm going to be talking about is SQL Server. Now, this is not a hard and fast requirement, but I kind of like the developer tools that Microsoft provides with Visual Studio and also SQL Server Management Studio. So I like to stick with SQL Server Management Studio and Visual Studio as much as I can. So on that note, if you are running SQL Server Management Studio, I highly recommend you to use SQL Server 2014 with Cumulative Update 6. What Cumulative Update 6 gives you is it gives you an option for you to publish your Sitefinity database right from inside SQL Server Management Studio all the way to like SQL Azure on Microsoft's cloud. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So now that we have prerequisites out of the way, now let's go ahead and get started. So we have 3 steps that we generally have to follow to get a Sitefinity website up and running in the cloud. The first step is we obviously have to go set up an Azure website. So it's a destination that your Sitefinity website is going to live under. To do that, I'll go on to the Azure web portal. So this is portal.azure.com, and I've already logged in with my account. So on the left-hand side, there is this App Services menu. So once you click that App Services menu, this basically gives you a list of app services that are part of your subscription. Now you can click on Add a new app service and basically configure all the necessary things that you would for an app service. What I highly recommend whenever you deploy any website to Azure, be it Sitefinity or even an ASP.NET website, is to create a dedicated resource group for your web application. What resource group gives you with Azure is it basically allows you to group all the necessary things in your web application. Now your web application might use a website, it might use a database, it might use like Chris talked about, like an Azure search or a Redis cache mechanism. I highly recommend you to put all of those resources in a dedicated resource group. So all you have to do here is to type in the application and name that you want to create. Like you can basically just type in your website name and then pick the subscription and pick the resource group. I've already created a web service or a web app for the demo that we are going to be doing here. It's the Sitefinity web app, Azure Falafel. So as soon as the deployment is done, so whenever you're creating a new service in Azure, it tends to take a little bit of time. It starts all the way from like instant. It can go all the way up till like 15 minutes or so. So just to save some time, I've already created this web application in Azure. So this is the web application that we will be publishing to from our Sitefinity instance. All right. The one important thing that I want to talk about whenever we are deploying Sitefinity to Microsoft Azure is this scale-up possibilities. The reason I want to touch base on the scale-up possibilities is I highly recommend S1 or above. So Azure has a lot of pricing tiers when it comes to how much resources your Sitefinity website can potentially have in their cloud. So I highly recommend S1 or above, and Chris will talk about the more scaling up and scaling out options when I pass the baton back to him. So the reason I recommend S1 at the minimum is S1 has this concept called deployment slots. You can compare S1 and B1 here. They both have like one core. They both have 1.75 gigabytes of RAM. So from a hardware point of view, they're pretty much similar. But where they differ is they actually S1 actually has a deployment slot that you could use. What a deployment slot in Azure means is this is a staging kind of environment that you can use to deploy from your Sitefinity application. So you can basically stand up a whole staging Sitefinity environment where you can give access to your business owners or your testing team and things like that, where you can push all the latest and greatest changes. And where you don't have to really break your production website, or you don't have to really deploy them to your production website before all of the testing procedure and all the validation procedure is done. So I highly recommend using S1 and deployment slots, which provide you with that staging capability. And once you have that staging capabilities, you would basically just publish it to your staging environment. And once everything is validated, you would then switch it back to the full, you then basically publish to your production environment. All right. So now let's go ahead and create a deployment slot. So in order to do that, I just clicked on that All Settings section, which opened up a settings plate for me, and inside that there is a publishing section which has a deployment slots option. So if I click on the deployment slots option, I don't have any deployment slot for this particular website. I can basically go ahead and add a slot. And the general naming convention for any slot is I generally just tend to name it simply like that, right? You can basically say staging or test or dev. You can have like multiple different deployment slots. With S1, you get 5 deployment slots, and from my experience, that has been good for majority of the websites that I work with when it comes to Sitefinity. Most of the times, we end up having 3 different slots: one for dev, one for QA, one for production. But it's really up to your organization to decide what kind of deployment slots you would need. You can basically just go ahead and hit OK. So this starts the creation of deployment slot. Like I mentioned, sometimes it could take a little while, so be a little bit patient with it, and sometimes it could be like instant. Like right now, you actually, we actually already created a deployment slot. So let me click into this deployment slot and show you what it means. If you compare, let me scroll a little bit towards the left here, sorry. If you compare this dashboard, the Sitefinity Azure Web App Azure Falafel dashboard with this, you can pretty much say it's absolutely exactly the same thing. So you're actually running a different website, but the advantage of using deployment slots is you don't have to pay for it. You're already paying for the app service, which comes with 5 different deployment slots. You're not really paying for any other new websites that you're hosting on Azure. All right. So now that we have the deployment slots and the app service configured, let's go back on to our development tools and try to get our Sitefinity database and also the Sitefinity web app here. To do that, I'm going to be opening up the SQL Server Management Studio. Like I said, I highly recommend SQL Server Management Studio 2014 or 2014 with cumulative update 6 or above. Microsoft just recently even released 2016, so you can easily use it with the Management Studio as well. There are 2 different options to get your Sitefinity database up in the cloud. The first one is you can simply right-click on the database. This is the database that I'm going to be publishing. You can simply right-click on the database, click on Tasks, and you have an option called Deploy Database to Microsoft SQL Database. Now again, let me reiterate this. If you are on older versions of SQL Server Management Studio, you will not see this option called Deploy Database to Microsoft Azure SQL Database. You have to be at least on SQL Server 2014 cumulative update 6 or above to see this option. If you don't have it, you'll just see just this one option. You won't see this one. All right. Let me go ahead and click this. Now it's basically telling me that it's going to walk me through a wizard on how to get my local database that is sitting on my local machine up all the way onto cloud. I'll say yes, go ahead and hit next. So this is where SQL Server Management Studio asks you for a connection to the server. Now this is slightly important because what Azure does by default is they block connections from external IP addresses. So you, from your machine, shouldn't be able to connect ideally to Azure SQL database. And the way to get around that, or the way Microsoft wants you to use it, is if you click on SQL servers, there's that Sitefinity Azure Falafel. I already created a SQL server. Like I said, most of this provisioning takes a little bit of time, so I've created all of this a little ahead of time. But the procedure to create anything is very similar. You can just click on Add, and you should be able to fill in rest of the things there. So the reason I'm here is I'll click on the database server that I already created. And in the general section under the settings blade, I'll click on firewall. And if you are accessing Azure or SQL Server from a new machine, ideally your client IP address will show up right here, and you can basically add your client IP address to the firewall settings of Azure so that your SQL Server that you're using, SQL Server Management Studio that you're using from this section has access to Azure. If you do not grant access in the firewall section, latest versions of SQL Server are smart about it. They'll actually tell you, hey, I don't see your IP address be part of the firewall rules in Azure, and they'll ask you to add it right from there. Now, one gotcha that I like to remind most of the developers on the call is this IP address. Please make sure that if you're using a static IP address, then you're pretty much good to go. But if you're not on a static IP address, and if your IP address changes based on your internet connection provider, you might have to do this often. So if you see the firewall message pop up out of nowhere one day, the chances of that being associated with your internet provider changing IP are really high. So please come back to this portal and make sure, and this all automatically lists my client IP address. So please make sure that this is already set up. So I can click on connect. It's going to ask me what my server name is, and all of this information I can actually grab right from inside this settings section inside of Azure. And this is the server name that I'm using. It's going to ask me what my login name is and password is. I'm going to type in my password, and I'll hit connect, and it automatically connected. So it's going to ask me what the database name is. I'm just going to trick it here and just say new or something so that we don't overwrite the existing database. And finally, it's going to tell me what pricing tier this particular database is going to be under. Most Sitefinity sites that I work with generally start off with basic, and as and when there is need for it, they keep upgrading to like the standard and premium tiers. So for the demo, we're going to be quickly using the basic section, and I will hit next here. Let's give it 1 second while it's trying to communicate back to Azure. And it's now telling me, hey, I now verified all the things. Your source is about 31 megabytes, and your destination is on Azure. It's basically publishing to this Sitefinity Azure SQL Server with the database name of this. And as soon as I hit finish, what it's going to do is it's going to basically go through the motion of creating all the scripts from my database. It's going to script out my entire database, and then it's going to re-import that database on SQL Server. Now you can imagine this step generally takes a little bit of time, so I'm not going to hit finish. I already did this, which is where my Sitefinity Azure for lawful database server is originating from. The other option, like let's say if your database is too high, and generally this deployment wizard has some level of cap. I've had it work well with databases that are less than 600 megabytes in size or less. But if your database is more than that, the other option you could do is you can export a DAC pack from here, and you can go back to your Azure and then import the DAC pack using this import a database command. All right. So that is the database part of the demo. The last piece of the demo is actually getting your Sitefinity application up on the cloud, right? We've basically configured where it needs to go. We basically got our database up. The last part is we have to obviously get the Sitefinity website up into the cloud. Now, like I mentioned, think of Sitefinity as any other ASP.NET application. The most general workflow to do with any ASP.NET application is to click on this build and click on publish. And I already configured this, so let me actually go back to this profile. If you have not configured anything, you will just end up on this profile as tab inside the publish section. And the first thing that you need to do is select where you would be publishing. So I'd say, okay, we already created an Azure app service, so I'm going to be assuming that's where we'll be publishing. So I can click on publish to an Azure app service. And if you are not logged in, Visual Studio is going to ask you to log in, and it's going to basically tell you to pick the right subscription and things like that. Now here's my Sitefinity Azure resource group that I've created, and inside that there's my Sitefinity Web App Azure full web application. And if I expand that, I can actually keep expanding. I'll see a deployment slot, and there is like a staging deployment slot that we just created. So I can actually just publish straight onto the staging slot as well, right from inside my Visual Studio environment, and not worry about it. Now this is if we configured everything. Now let me just show you if you did not configure the web application, and if you did not configure the resource groups and things like that, what you would do. What you do in that scenario is, instead of picking the application, you basically click this new section, and Visual Studio is going to tell me, hey, pick some web app name which is very similar to this app service section that we've created, and it's going to tell me what resource, what subscription it should go on, and it's going to also ask me what resource group it should go on. And like I said, you can pick the right resource group here. You can create the new resource group as well. So you already have a Sitefinity Azure Falafel resource group, which is generally where I would be publishing it to. Now let me cancel out of this, because I don't want to go through the motion of creating one more website. And again, like I said, most of these creations tend to take a little bit of time, so bear with Azure while that process is going. So for the demo, I'm just going to be publishing straight onto the Azure Web App Azure Falafel, and I'll hit OK here. And as soon as I hit OK, it's going to create me all the settings that it needs. It's going to basically tell me what server it's publishing it to. It's going to tell me what the site name is, what the username is, and what are all the destination URLs for this. One quick way to make sure that you have all the settings in place is you can just simply click this Validate Connection button. And what Visual Studio does is it basically tries to do a query with this particular destination URL and for the site name and username and the password that you are providing. There's that little checkbox which indicates that everything is going well. Now, like I said, I already have a deployment profile that I just basically did the exact same thing. All I did was I just selected that and I hit publish, which basically made my Sitefinity web application go on to the Microsoft Azure App Service Cloud. All right, let me close this because I don't want to click that, because it might again take a few moments for me to show that. One thing that I always run into whenever I'm deploying to Azure is the Azure SDK version number that I talked about. Azure SDK version that Sitefinity supports is 2.6 and above. Now, if you are using 2.6, that is totally fine, but if you're using 2.7 or 2.8 or any of the new beta releases of Azure SDK, please come into your web.config and add an assembly redirect binding for the Microsoft.Windows Azure.Service Runtime DLL. Just make sure that whenever anything below 0 or 2.6 is referenced, just make sure that it is going to 2.7 or whatever Azure SDK version that you have installed and your app service is using. This is one of the common errors that I see if people are using newer versions of Azure SDK, but if you're on 2.6, you're guaranteed that everything's going to go well. Now, like I said, I already published all of this, and if I just basically reload my web application, here's my Sitefinity web application that I have been developing that is all the way up on Azure. You see the URL is also on azurewebsites.net. One quick thing that I forgot to mention earlier is the database connection. It generally lives in the data config section inside of the app data folder. You have to change this connection string either in here where you are pointing to your Sitefinity database that you created, and the other thing that you have to also make sure is the database type is of type SQL Azure for everything to go perfectly as planned. Make sense? So that is the 3 different steps that you need to follow to get your Sitefinity website up in the cloud. Now there is one more way other than just using Visual Studio to publish your Sitefinity application up onto cloud. That is using continuous integration with a lot of deployment scripts using PowerShell. Now, Sitefinity team has done a fantastic job at providing a lot of script files for us to do this continuous integration with PowerShell scripts, and they have a GitHub repository here on github.com/Sitefinity, and you basically just look for Sitefinity Azure PowerShell deployment. And inside the scripts folder, they have a lot of PowerShell scripts that they already created, and the configuration folder is where you first go in and then tweak the configurations. And if you just run a bunch of PowerShell scripts, you'll automatically publish your web application, create like Redis cache, create your database. All of them could be just done via PowerShell as well. All right, so that concludes my portion of showing how to get your Sitefinity web application up in the cloud. Now I'm going to pass it back on to Chris, who's going to be showing you how to scale the web application that we've created back on Azure. All right?
All right, thank you, Venkata. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. So as Venkata said, I'm going to go ahead and show you how to take advantage of scaling vertically and horizontally. So having some instant scalability in the cloud, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means, so vertically and horizontally. All right, so let me go ahead and get back into the Azure dashboard here. I'm going to go ahead, this is Venkata's deployment that he's already done. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look here at the app services. In the app services, we are going to see the Sitefinity Azure Falafel web app there. So we can go ahead, we can see that's running. And I'm going to go ahead here. Venkata kind of touched on this. There's a couple ways to do this. One of the things that you notice whenever Venkata had done a deployment, you can also change this later, you'll have something called an app service plan. So an app service plan is sort of a container, or it's a description of what you want your website to be running as. And you can see here I have the scale, so vertically, how big are the machines going to be? And what we mean by scale vertically is we mean adding more hardware, right? So not adding more instances, but adding more hardware. So here we have an S1. We could obviously make it an S2, an S3, or a premium as well. It's kind of interesting, you know, the S1 is the minimum that Venkata talked about that works really well. You also get the staging slots. You can also, you know, move it to S2. And then we can also do scale horizontally as well, which we're going to talk about in a second. I do want to stop for a second, though, and answer some questions. There was a couple questions in the chat window that I did want to talk about, where people were talking about moving to Azure. One of the questions was that someone has multiple databases. They had some other databases that were SQL databases that were not Sitefinity databases, but they were doing data lookups and, you know, using those databases as well. So, you know, if you're moving Sitefinity to Azure and you have those SQL databases and they don't need to be on-premise, you can move them to SQL Azure as well. You know, you don't need to do data pools or things like that. You can just actually stand them up as individual SQL databases here. They can be, what you'll see around the SQL databases is, if you look here at Venkata's database that he has in the cloud, he actually has a database server connected with this as well. So, so here's the connection string, the server, and this is the server name. So if I were to click on the server, it would actually show me the SQL server with all the databases. So I could actually just add a new database here. So we could import a new database as well. Whenever you create a new SQL database, it will give you the option to go ahead and put it on an existing SQL server. So think about, you know, Azure is having its own SQL servers, and then it does do database management. So it does do database management at the database layer, and it does have the ability for you to go ahead and add it to an existing server. So I can pick the server here to make sure that we have that. So kind of going back to the question, which was I have all these other extra databases that I need to do lookups. You can certainly have them, just create them as different databases, and just as Venkata had talked about changing the connection string, you can go here and you can go ahead and show the database connection strings. You can get the connection string from here, update your web config in the connection string settings, and you'll be able to connect to it. If that database does need to live on-premise, and you need to get a connection to the database, and you still want to run your Sitefinity website in Azure, you can use the Azure networking piece of this, and I forget the name of it right now, but it is the ability to connect your on-premise to Azure via your own line that you would get from your own ISP. So you have the ability to go ahead and connect, so you get a stable connection in between the two. Your web apps, if we go back and take a look at the settings here, can actually connect to a network. So you could actually have a network. You could bring in an external network from your on-premise to the cloud, and you can make calls to that as part of this. So you can go through and go ahead and connect your app services to a network that's connected to an on-premise network. So you have the ability to get your Sitefinity instance connected to data that does have to live on-premise. And I'll show you what that looks like here. So there is networking here, and underneath the networking we can go ahead and add a VNet, and then we can add a hybrid connection, which gets us into the ability to connect on-premise databases to Azure via a known ISP that you would provide to them. All right. I also wanted to take a minute. Somebody asked about load balancing. So right now, this is only running as a single instance. You can have more than one instance here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about horizontally. We can also, too, if we wanted to have this be geo-redundant. So we have customers today that actually take their Sitefinity websites and they actually run versions of it in the West Coast, and they have the same versions running on the East Coast. So they actually have 2 instances running on West and 2 instances running on East. So it actually looks like 2 web apps here, both being in different regions. So one of the things that you'll see about this is this is running in the West US. If we were to go ahead and deploy an Azure website here, we could pick East US as well. And with that, we could have the same Sitefinity website deployed in 2 different places. And then what we would do on top of that is we would go ahead and deploy the Traffic Manager. So what that's going to give you the ability to do with Traffic Manager is you can go ahead and it says coming soon here, but it is available. So if you go ahead and do traffic routing, what you have the ability to do is create a Traffic Manager. You can connect it to these websites, and what it will do is you can actually do a couple of things. You can do load balancing. So if you wanted to have multiple tiers and have app pools where you had multiple apps in the same location, you could do that. You can also do fault tolerance. So you can actually do a primary and then a secondary for failover. So you have the ability to do that from a Traffic Manager perspective. So you can actually have that going on for you. And so we'll notice, like, if something happened in the West data center, or something happened from a maintenance perspective where it took down all of your sites, which should never happen in Azure. But if that happened, it would just shift the data over to your East data center, and it would continue on as well. All right, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the scale up. So we talked a little bit about the scale up. So we obviously have the ability to create new instances, or take these instances and scale them up from a hardware perspective. We also have the ability to go ahead and scale them horizontally, which is going to give us the ability to make more instances here. So we could go ahead, you can see that we have 1 here. We could go ahead and 2, 3, 4, 5. We could go all the way up to 10, right? You saw it in the actual app service plan, the actual count. So you saw the count here for that was 10, and this actually gives me 10 instances. If I need to have 20 instances on that slider, then I need to be at the premium, right? So this gives me the ability to scale horizontally up to 20. And then if I need to get more than 20, I can actually create 2 of these sites with 20 in it. So if I needed 40, I could go and create 2 20s and put Traffic Manager on top of it, and it would be happy, right? So so not only do you have the ability to scale directly in the app service plans, but you can also put hardware, but software. You could put Traffic Manager on top of it, so you could even scale it more than that. All right, so kind of scaling out again. So we have the ability to scale out here. So I'm going to go ahead and put 4. You can see here I have scale by instance or manually, right? The ability to scale by CPU percentage. So if you're not sure when you're going to get spikes, and you want to make this kind of auto scale, What you can do here is you can go ahead and put thresholds in place. So you can basically say, hey, I want to scale up by 2, and I want to make it 4 on the way down. And what you would want to do, so this is CPU percentage. So what this is going to do, and that's going to make a max 4, by the way. So this max is going to be 4 over here. So if I want to have up to 6 instances, I don't want it to go beyond that, I can set that max. It can go all the way up to 10. And this is a minimum as well. So if you set the minimum, it'll be 2. It'll automatically change your instance counts to 2, minimum 2, maximum 10. And then what's going to happen is it's going to go ahead and increase your instances whenever you can set the CPU range here. So you can basically say, hey, whenever it hits the high range, whenever the CPUs hit 80% across all the machines, I want it to start scaling up. And whenever the CPU hits 40% on the way down, so if traffic dies down and they all aggregate 40%, it's going to start dropping machines to keep it in between the thresholds for you. So it will start auto-scaling for you based on the percentages for up and down. You also you can schedule, so if you know, hey, like you're running an HR system and everybody's going to go enter their time and it's going to be Friday at 5 p.m. because that's when most people enter their time if they have to do that sort of thing. You can go ahead and schedule this based on performance rules, and there's also a way to do it based on time as well. Let's see the rule here, but I think there is a time operator. I have to go back and look at that. It looks like they moved the cheese on me, so I don't know where it's at. But these are actually more in depth than the actual plan that used to be there. So they actually used to be just a place to go in instead of based on time. So, and I don't see that now. They must have just updated that recently. All right, so that's what we mean by scaling up and scaling down. So, with that, I know that we are running out of time. So I do want to go ahead and thank you for joining our webcast today. It was great to go ahead and talk to you about Azure and Sitefinity and how they are great together. I hope you learned a lot. I see there's lots of questions. If you have more questions, we will be around for the next 8 minutes or so to answer them. And with that, we do appreciate you joining, and thank you very much.